full-scale war between Russia and NATO.
This was a defining week in geopolitics. Russia has been declared as the permanent enemy of the West. NATO had once called Russia a strategic partner. Yesterday, the alliance labeled it a direct threat. The threat of war, a bigger war, is growing. The West is responding. NATO will boost its battle-ready troops by 7 times. Finland and Sweden have got an invite to join the NATO. The US is getting a permanent base in Eastern Europe. Then how can Europe stay behind? The continent is about to change forever. Leaders of Europe are stepping up to fight Russia. NATO's eastern flank has emerged as a new front line in the battle against Russia. Britain's top general wants his troops to prepare for war. Germany wants to ramp up its military capabilities quickly. Just like the US, these European powers are committing more troops and military resources. Europe has now adopted a new Cold War doctrine. Gravitas tonight will tell you all about it. What you just saw were NATO's military drills. In June, 16 NATO allies conducted a major military exercise. Finland and Sweden participated too. There were 45 ships, more than 75 aircraft and 7,500 troops. Such drills will become a regular feature now. Yesterday we told you how Europe could become the new battleground because Europe feels threatened by Russia. European leaders are making some dire predictions. The top general of the British forces has given some advice. He says the United Kingdom should prepare for war. Germany too is worried. It has announced a fresh round of deployments. Europe is now adopting a Cold War doctrine. On Gravitas tonight. That's what we'll discuss. The annual NATO summit ended yesterday. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg ended the event with a warning. He declared that Russia is quote-unquote the most significant and direct threat to NATO today. And the implications of a full-scale war with Russia would be dire.
At the same time, we also know that this can get worse. Because if this becomes a full-scale war between Russia and NATO, then we'll see suffering, damage, death, destruction at a scale which is much, much worse than what we see in Ukraine today.
Suffering at a scale that's much worse than Ukraine. Why is the NATO chief, in fact, worried? The military alliance has released an assessment. It has highlighted 3 major concerns. Concern number 1, NATO says Russia is trying to destabilize northern and eastern Europe. Concern number 2, the Russian military buildup. NATO says Russian forces have a presence in 3 regions, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. These regions are dangerously close to NATO member states, hence the military threat. And concern number 3, Russia's relationship with Belarus. NATO believes there is now a tight military integration between Moscow and Minsk. And that challenges NATO's security and interests. This is the assessment as of today. It will change. It will change because Vladimir Putin has vowed to match any NATO deployment toe-to-toe. The US is driving NATO's aggressive moves, but Europe is no more on the sidelines. Major European partners are stepping up their contribution. Let's start with the United Kingdom. General Patrick Sanders is the new Chief of General Staff of the British Army. He took charge last month. This week, he gave a speech. It was more like a warning. General Sanders said the UK should prepare for war. And I have the quote with me. In Ukraine, we've seen the limitations of deterrence by punishment. We must stop Russia seizing territory rather than expecting to respond to a land grab with a delayed counter-offensive. To succeed, the British Army, in conjunction with our NATO allies and partners, must be in place, or especially high readiness, ideally a mix of both. Tripwires are not enough. The British government seems to agree. This week, they boosted their deployments to NATO. Britain is increasing its troop strength in Europe. London plans to keep more than 1,600 troops in Estonia. The soldiers will be equipped with helicopters and artillery systems. And that's not all. The UK plans to expand its NATO headquarters in Tallinn. It will be led by a brigadier. What about his responsibilities? Supporting the rapid deployment of troops if needed. The United Kingdom is adding more firepower to NATO forces. It will send RAF Typhoon and F-35 fighter jets, also aircraft carriers. These will be made available to NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. And this is the general who directs all NATO military operations. Now let's talk about Germany. What are Berlin's plans? Germany would maintain a regional marine command in the Baltic Sea and a tank division with 15,000 soldiers, 60 aircraft and 20 naval units. Here is what German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said about this.
NATO has once again changed its view on Moscow. Through its aggressive politics, Russia has become a threat again for Europe and for the alliance. It threatens the international order. NATO will therefore improve its defense capabilities, especially when looking at the security of its members on its eastern flank.
Insbesondere mit Blick auf die Sicherheit ihrer Mitglieder entlang der Ostflanke.
Russia's actions are a threat to us, so we are responding. Europe's eastern flank is at the center of this response. It looks just like a battleground now. 8 countries represent the new front line against Russia: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria. There are at least 300,000 soldiers being deployed here. This region is under 24/7 air surveillance. A little further back, NATO members have stationed carrier strike groups, warships from the United States, Italy, the United Kingdom and France. These guard the waters in and around Eastern Europe. Now join the dots. Look at the expanse and the level of deployments. To say the situation is tense is an understatement. Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine are making things worse. We were promised a Russian blitzkrieg. Instead, it's a war of attrition now in Ukraine. And in such conflicts, 2 things are very important: patience and resources. The West is trying to drain both. Their sanctions are not just testing Russia's economy, they're also testing Putin's patience. But are they working? According to Putin himself, no, they're not. In a recent interview, he was asked about possible deadlines in the Donbass. Listen to his reply. There is no need to talk about any deadlines. This is Vladimir Putin. I never talk about it since this is life and these are real things. A deadline is linked to the intensity of combat operations, which is directly linked to potential casualties. And we must think above all things about protecting our guys' lives. A couple of things to note here. 1, he says there are no deadlines. It depends on how intense the fighting is. And 2, he says protecting his soldiers is most important. Is it though? Russia last released their casualty figures in the month of March. That's almost 3 months back. And since then, they have acknowledged 0 casualties. What does that mean? Either Russia has had 0 casualties, they've lost no soldiers in the last 3 months, or they're refusing to acknowledge the sacrifice of their soldiers. It's not much of a puzzle. But coming back to the deadline, if Putin is serious about prolonging the war, it will have repercussions. And his decision depends on a lot of factors. Number 1, how long will NATO keep supporting Ukraine? Joe Biden says as long as necessary. The US president has announced another round of military aid, total value almost $800 million. As long as NATO keeps the war chest open, this war will drag on. Factor number 2, the resistance in the Donbass. Putin laid out 3 military objectives in his latest interview: liberating the East, protecting the local population, and creating favorable security conditions for Russia. And that last one probably refers to Ukraine's neutrality. The speed of this mission depends on Ukrainian resistance. If they fight for every inch, this could get ugly. If not, Russia could wind up the war with Donbass. They've already taken Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. They have taken a key oil refinery. Now, factor number 3, the money. Russia's economy may be battered, but they're dragging the world down with them. Right now, the Western public will cheer these huge military shipments, but what if there's a recession? Will the US public still back Biden's multi-million-dollar aid to Ukraine? Chances are they won't. Putin too is affected by the economy, but he's relatively insulated. He doesn't have to face elections, you see. Plus, he can always crack down on dissent. That's not a luxury that Biden enjoys. He has midterm elections coming up in November. If he loses the Congress, it's game over for him. So pressure is building on both sides, and occasionally it shows. I'll give you an example from this week. Ukraine claims a shopping mall in Kremenchuk was hit by Russian missiles. They've released CCTV footage of the strike. Apparently 1,000 people were inside, out of which 18 were killed. Now, why is the strike important? A, because it's a civilian asset, and B, it is located far away from the front lines. Such attacks have no strategic value. They're meant to demoralize the local population, to put pressure on the leaders in Kiev. Another example is Snake Island. Let's pull up the map for you. Snake Island is located near the Danube Delta in the Black Sea. It is key to defending southern Ukraine. On day 1 of the invasion, Russia captured this island. But this week, almost 4 months later, Russia has vacated it. Snake Island is now under Ukrainian control. There are 2 versions about what happened. Ukraine claims they drove the Russians out. Russia claims it was a goodwill gesture. A goodwill gesture in the middle of a war? Goodwill for what? For resuming wheat trade in the Black Sea. Either way, it's a loss for Russia. It reaffirms their pivot in the last few weeks. Instead of targeting Kiev, they're limiting themselves to the Donbass. So coming back to my first question, will this war drag on? Well, it will, unless our leaders can grow up. And I mean this literally. Let me play out an exchange from the G7 summit this week. These are the men and women shaping the course of history. Take a look at their conversation.
Jackie talk. We just let me take our clothes off. We all have to show them what's tough. The bare chest horseback ride is played with the
Oh, yes. Horseback ride is
We're going to show our peps.
You heard those leaders of the G7. They were mocking Putin's macho displays, and needless to say, he had a comeback. Putin says it would be disgusting, that's the word he used, disgusting if the G7 leaders stripped down. You have to hear this stuff.
I don't know which way they wanted to strip down, from top or from the bottom, but I think that would be a disgusting sight anyway. But if I can reference Alexander Pushkin, I may be wrong about the exact words, but one may be all about business and think of the condition of one's nails be well groomed.
Just a gentle reminder, these are world leaders, some of the most powerful men and women of our times. They're supposed to be super busy right now with a pandemic, a war, a looming recession. Instead, they're busy body shaming and mocking each other. The people of Ukraine do not care if Putin takes off his shirt. They don't care about Boris Johnson's non-existent muscles. They're only concerned about their freedom, and for that, diplomacy must triumph. You could say the same about the global economy. If world leaders don't get their act together, we could be in for a lot of pain, even worse than during the pandemic. And I'll tell you why. This year has been the worst start for global stocks on record, the worst ever. How much damage are we talking about? Nearly $13 trillion. 13 trillion. Global investors have lost $13 trillion in the first 6 months of 2022. Even the pandemic years were not this bad. And why is that? Because 2020 was an economic slowdown. 2022 could be a recession. Let's look at 3 important indicators: the stocks, the factory output, and inflation. We'll start with the United States. Their index NASDAQ is down 30% in 2022. Japan's Nikkei is down 11%. India's Nifty 10%. China's Shanghai Composite down 6.7%. European stocks 17%. Every major market has crashed this year. And chances are this is just the start. For stocks to recover, economic activity must pick up. And what does that mean? It means factories must increase output, the job market must expand, foreign investment should flow in. Only then will the markets recover. But right now, the exact opposite is happening, which brings us to the second indicator, factory output. It tells you how the manufacturing sector is performing. And right now, it's not so good. The Eurozone manufacturing fell last month. It was the first decline since early 2020. Same with Britain. Their manufacturing outlook is the gloomiest since May 2020. What about Asia? South Korea's factory output dropped for the second month. So did Japan's. Only India and China reported slight increases, but you can barely count that as growth. The fact is, manufacturing is stalled. Factories are simply not increasing output. You could ask why, and we'll tell you. Two major reasons. One is higher inflation. Raw materials are simply too expensive today, so factories are cutting down on output. The second reason is falling demand. People are bracing for a recession by the end of this year. So naturally, they're not in the mood to spend. Their tendency is to save every penny, especially with inflation on the prowl. Now, this time, Europe has set a new record. Inflation in the Eurozone has topped 8.6%. It's the highest rate since 1997. Some countries are worse off than others, like Spain. Their inflation has crossed 10%. So what is the European Union planning to do? What every country is doing. The European Central Bank is planning an interest hike, the first one in almost 11 years. But is it too late? Central banks had a narrow window to ace the soft landing, to strike a balance between inflation and growth, but that window is closing fast. The new interest hikes may or may not control inflation, but they will hurt economic output. They will slow down growth, possibly derail all hopes of a recovery. How is India responding to this looming crisis? In two ways. Number one is by scooping up good deals wherever possible, even if that means doing business with Russia and more business with Russia. India has significantly increased the import of Russian oil. It is being sold at heavy discounts to India, Russian oil. And now Indian businesses are eyeing the Russian market. Dozens of Western companies have left Russia. This could be India's chance to capture some of that market. A few companies are already in talks, like Berger Paints, Dr. Reddy's, CCL Products, all of them are planning to expand their Russian footprint. And that's not all. Indian retailers could soon open stores in Russia. Vladimir Putin confirmed this development at the BRICS summit. But which retailers? That he did not mention. Strategy number two for India, preemptive action. The Indian government announced a wave of new measures on Friday. I'll list them out. The import duty on gold has been hiked. It was 7.5%. The new import duty is 12.5%. On steel, an export duty has been levied, 15% on all exports. But the biggest changes are in the oil sector. Indian producers will now have to pay what they call a windfall tax. How much? Around $294 per ton. Think of it as an additional tax. Also, some quotas have been established. Like 50% of gasoline you sell abroad must be sold domestically. I'll explain that. Suppose you sell 100 liters of gasoline abroad. Then your domestic sales must make up at least 50% of that. In this example, at least 50 liters must be sold in India. There's a similar quota for diesel as well. Around 30% has to be sold domestically. Now, all of these are preemptive moves. They have the same ultimate goals. One is to prop up the rupee, and two, to save forex. Right now, the Indian rupee is in free fall. It's down almost 8% compared to January, which means India is paying more for the same imports. It is draining its reserves at a faster rate. So what does the government do? Try to recover some of that money. Oil producers are already making a fortune because of the rising prices. The windfall tax will level that up. The government will basically get a cut. And what about the quotas and the gold duties? They will help reduce imports. Indian gold prices increased $15 today, and when the prices rise, the demand falls. If these policies work out, the Indian rupee will strengthen. And that will set off a chain reaction. Imports will become cheaper, inflation will cool off, economic activity will resume. But just like everywhere else in the world, one question still remains. Was India too late in making these moves? The RBI still has an impressive forex stock, nearly $600 billion, but the trajectory is a bit worrying. The reserves have dropped by $11 billion in the last 3 weeks. So Indians are also playing the waiting game, waiting to see if the soft landing sticks. Our next story is about Jugaad. What is Jugaad? It's a Hindi term for a hack, a simple workaround to deal with a complicated problem. That's what a Jugaad is. What is the biggest problem in geopolitics today? Doing business with Russia. You can't pay for Russian goods the traditional way. All banking channels are closed. Any direct business transaction with Russia will trigger Western sanctions. But Indian companies have not stopped doing business with Russia. They have found a hack. Ultratech is India's biggest cement producer. A report says it is importing cargo of Russian coal. How are they doing it? By paying the seller in Chinese yuan. How does that work? Paying for Russian coal in Chinese currency. I'll explain that. Ultratech is buying coal from Russia's Siberian Coal Energy Company, also called SUEK. Now, first of all, why does a cement company need coal? Well, coal is the main fuel to manufacture cement. How much coal did Ultratech buy? This consignment, the one we are talking about, was of 157,000 tons. It was loaded at a Russian port called Vanino. How much is the consignment worth? The invoice is of around $25 million. Reports say Ultratech made this payment in yuan, around 172 million yuan to be precise. How was this purchase arranged? Now, reports say SUEK has a business unit in Dubai. The sale was arranged from there. How the mechanism works exactly is not yet clear. Presumably, the business unit in Dubai accepts payments in yuan and then the coal is shipped. Other companies are also using this route. They make the payment in yuan and then they take the coal from Russia. It works for Moscow too because they like the Chinese currency. The Russian central bank keeps yuan in its reserves. About 13% of Russian reserves are in yuan assets. So Moscow can convert the yuan into the ruble. Now, how do Indian businesses get the yuan? There is one possible source. They could go to a Chinese bank, either in mainland China or in Hong Kong. There they exchange the dollars for yuan. Remember, the sanctions are triggered when the payments to Russia go in dollars. But there are no such restrictions if you use China's yuan. So effectively, you're circumventing the US dollar and you're also circumventing Western sanctions. India and Russia are trying to figure out their own mechanism. So far, there is no progress on this front. Until that happens, businesses could resort to paying in yuan. A former Indian Economic Affairs Secretary believes trade in yuan could pick up in the days and weeks ahead. I have a statement with me. This is what he said. If the rupee-yuan-ruble route turns out to be favorable, the businesses have every reason and incentive to switch over. This is likely to happen more. Now, this mechanism might be new for India, but businesses around the world have been using the yuan widely. Since the Ukraine invasion, yuan to ruble trade has shot through the roof. I'll tell you how much. The yuan-ruble trade has increased by a whopping 1,067%. So the yuan workaround works. But is this the right way forward? Using the yuan means empowering China. Let's face it, Russia cannot be isolated from the global economy just because the West wants it. Countries and businesses will buy Russian energy because it is cheaper. And that is the reality. But do we have to strengthen China in this process? Trading in yuan increases the demand for the Chinese currency. Chinese mouthpieces have put out some data. The use of yuan by central banks has increased. It is at a 5-year high. So more central banks around the world are keeping yuan in their reserves. So far, the US dollar has dominated global trade, and it still does. But China wants to replace the dollar. It wants the yuan to become the global currency. So if the world uses more yuan, Beijing's influence in global trade will rise. It's as simple as that. China is trying to leverage this momentum. It has reached out to 5 countries and regions: Indonesia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Chile. With China, These 5 are building a yuan reserve. And all 6 of them, all 6 partners, will create a yuan pool. They will contribute a minimum of 15 billion yuan each to the pool. That's around $2.2 billion. How will this help China? Beijing is creating a global financial system, one that is driven by the yuan. It will challenge the dollar system. So the world will have 2 systems to deal with then, and a country that controls the financial system dictates global trade. The world cannot let China have that power. The yuan hack helps, but it may hurt in the long run. Think about it. Our next story is from the United States. Their top court has delivered another big verdict. It has restricted federal powers to fight climate change. Now, this decision basically applies to America's Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. It's a federal government body. It regulates carbon emissions, but now it can no longer do that. The US Supreme Court has curbed the powers of this regulator. It has barred it from dictating terms to power plants. And this decision is yet another setback for President Joe Biden. He wanted to lead the world in climate action. But with the conservatives dominating the US judiciary, he cannot even bring systemic changes at home. Here's a report.
Rising sea levels, extreme weather, repeated wildfires, severe droughts. The United States of America faces all 4 of these challenges. In order to keep a check on them, it set up an executive body in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, a federal government organization. It enforces government regulations to protect America's natural resources and combat the effects of climate change. The US Supreme Court has clipped this body's wings. It has curbed the EPA's power to fight climate change. The decision will have profound consequences. Here's what it essentially entails. 1. The EPA can no longer regulate emissions from fossil fuel-fired power plants. 2. It cannot dictate power companies to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Basically, the regulator cannot enforce climate action anymore. This ruling is a setback to the Biden administration. It had promised to cut greenhouse gas emissions to half by 2030 and make the US a world leader in fighting global warming. The court's order will upset these plans. The president is disappointed. He says the decision is damaging. Climate activists are protesting. They are rallying against the ruling.
By the environmental folks who are concerned about the decision from the US Supreme Court.
Everyone ready? So I'm gonna...
Experts say the decision has turned back the clock, that it could have repercussions all over the world.
What we're looking at is a picture where democratic governments have less power to protect the public against harms, and private authority is much bigger.
Even the United Nations is dismayed. It says the decision could make the world sicker, hungrier, poorer, and more dangerous in the coming years.
Decisions like today's in the US or any other major emitting economy makes it harder to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement for a healthy, livable planet, especially as we need to accelerate the phase out of coal and transition to renewable energies.
The timing of this decision is also crucial. It comes immediately after the Roe versus Wade ruling was overturned. What this highlights is the growing assertiveness of conservatives, their sway in the nation's top judicial body. Just think about it. The latest decision was taken by a 6-3 majority of conservatives. 3 of them were appointed by Donald Trump. The lawsuit, too, was brought by 20 Republican attorney generals. This only shows how powerless the Democrats have become before the judiciary. They are themselves struggling to make systemic changes at home, but they expect the rest of the world to play by their rules.
Let's shift our attention to Australia. Lockdown has been imposed in New South Wales. There's a new outbreak. Local authorities are on alert. And I know what you must be thinking. The situation sounds a lot like a Wuhan virus outbreak. But this story is not about that. It's about the bees of Australia. A deadly parasite is causing panic. So Australia is locking down its bees, if that's even possible. Our next report tells you more.
Australia has been hit by a new pandemic. Another lockdown is being imposed. Not on humans, but on bees. The reason is a parasite. It has wiped out beehives around the world before. Now it has reached Australia. Beekeepers are fighting an outbreak of varroa mites. These are killer parasites who attack and feed on honeybees. The mite is red in color. It is barely 1.5 millimeters long, but it can inflict a lot of damage. Varroa mites feed on the body fat of honeybees and cause deformation or death. They were discovered last week at the Newcastle port. The parasite can't be allowed to spread. It could inflict serious damage on Australia's honey industry. Experts say it can destroy almost the entire wild honeybee population of Australia. Honey manufacturers stand to lose more than $70 million every year. They have only one option to defeat the parasite: a mass killing of bees. A lockdown zone has been created in New South Wales. The region accounts for almost half of Australia's commercial bee industry. As many as 600 beehives have been destroyed there, and with them, at least 6 million bees. Beekeepers are burning their beehives. They pour gasoline into them. Then they wait. After a day, they set them on fire. For the beekeepers, this outbreak couldn't have come at a worse time. Already, a slew of natural disasters has affected their business. It began with a drought in the beginning of 2022. Then floods and fires affected sales. Now the varroa mite is threatening their livelihoods. Local authorities have assured some compensation. Commercial beekeepers will be reimbursed for the bees and hives they destroy, but there is no plan to compensate them for lost income. Australia's fight against varroa mite is about to get more intense in the coming days. New eradication zones are being set up as beekeepers continue their hunt for the deadly mites. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
They say to err is human. To err repeatedly sometimes is also human. Look at what the US Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is doing. Reports say it is planning to allow clinical trials for transplant of pig organs into humans. Why? There's a shortage of human donor organs, so they're hoping pigs could fill the gap. Say someone has a liver failure, he could be saved by sacrificing a pig. Sounds revolutionary, for want of a better word, but it hasn't really taken off. You may remember this man, David Bennett. We told you his story. In January 2022, he was all over news headlines. He was 57 years old and critically ill. He was fitted with a pig heart. At first, it looked like a medical miracle. Bennett seemed fine, but 2 months later, he died. And he wasn't the first such case. In the 1990s, doctors tried using a pig heart as a bridge. What's that? They temporarily transplanted a pig heart into a human heart, only to keep that person going till they received a human heart later. That experiment failed. An attempt was also made to use a pig liver for bridging. Here too, the patient died. So in medical terms, the success rate does not favor this interspecies experiment. But the FDA wants to give it another chance. Reports say it may give a go-ahead for clinical trials, and that several research groups want the FDA to greenlight such trials, transferring pig organs into humans. They want to conduct mass-scale trials, and they need the agency's approval for that. Quick question: why pigs? Why not elephant organs or chimpanzees? Aren't chimpanzees closer to humans in terms of evolution? You may know this already. As species grow apart, they become genetically very different. Their organs, their molecular makeup, everything becomes very different. Now, since chimpanzees and baboons are closer to humans, they are our best bets at interspecies transplant, and experts realize this. So before trying out pigs, they transplanted organs from primates. In the 1960s, chimpanzee kidneys were transplanted into 12 patients. Most died within a few weeks. One survived for 9 months. Then baboon liver was transplanted into humans. All patients died. Attempts have also been made to transplant baboon heart. Again, failed. But this is not what stopped the experiments. Ethical concerns did. A chimpanzee and a baboon similarity with humans led to ethical concerns. And that's where pigs come in. That's why they were brought in. Even though pigs and humans are, 80 million years of evolution apart. So time is not really in our favor. What is, though, is the fact that pigs mature fast and they have more offspring. Also, pig tissues are already used for prosthetic heart valves. So a successful transplant would mean striking gold. So far, there have been none, though. Researchers still want to try. They say what happened with Bennett could be because of a virus. Apparently, the pig heart had a pig virus, and doctors found out about it only 20 days after the transplant. So is that why Bennett died? Or was it because the pig heart experiment just did not work? Researchers are not sure. Could large-scale trials put more people at risk? Of course they could. But what if there is still a chance of success, even if that chance is, say, 1%? Should such a risk be taken? Let me show you some numbers. According to one estimate, the US alone has over 100,000 people waiting for a transplant. 17 people die every day waiting for a transplant. Every 9 minutes, another person is added to the transplant waiting list. A successful trial could solve much of this problem. It could save lives, thousands of lives. It could give us access to unlimited organs, unlimited cells. Yes, the track record has not been favorable. There's also the risk of transmitting viruses and microorganisms. There is an immunity barrier. And how can we dismiss the ethical concerns here? Having said that, a trial cannot be a bad idea, we think. When researchers started human-to-human transplants, the success rate was even lower. But they persisted, and over the years, revolutionized medical science. But for all we know, pig transplants is another revolution waiting to happen. We'll keep you posted on the progress. Before I end tonight's show, I want to wish all doctors a very happy Doctors' Day. It's the 1st of July and it is National Doctors' Day in India. The day marks the birth anniversary of Dr. Bidhan Chandra Roy. 1st of July also happens to be his death anniversary. Dr. Roy was unique in more ways than one. He was a physician, philanthropist and social worker. He was also among the pioneers of healthcare in India. Let me tell you a little about him, Dr. Roy. He was born in Patna in the year 1882. He studied at the Medical College and then at London's St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He was also a fellow at the Royal College of Surgeons. When he returned to India, Dr. Roy began teaching at the Calcutta Medical College. He was also Mahatma Gandhi's physician. He helped in setting up several hospitals in India. He was part of the team that founded the Indian Medical Association, also the Medical Council of India. In 1925, he entered politics. He died as the second Chief Minister of the Indian state of West Bengal. A year before that, before his death, Dr. Bidhan Chandra Roy was conferred India's highest civilian honour, the Bharat Ratna. The 1st of July celebrates not just Dr. Roy, but every doctor out there. Making it through over the last 2 years of the pandemic, would not have been possible without our doctors. When the Wuhan virus struck, our doctors rose to the occasion. They went out on the battlefield to fight the unknown virus. We stayed at home, within the safety of the four walls, while the doctors never left the front line. They were there in hospitals, working endless shifts away from their loved ones, so that you and I could be safe. The last 2 years have not been easy on any of us, but for doctors, they've been especially bad. They have seen people die in front of them. They have lived in PPE kits, many without them, and yet through all of it, they did not waver from their duty. They answered our phone calls at all hours. They replied to our frantic WhatsApps. And I cannot really fathom how so many of us would have made it through the deadly waves without these doctors. So my message to all Gravitas viewers today is this: spare a minute send a thank you message to your doctor. Tell them you wish them good health. For the moment, we look at what else is making news across the world. This is Gravitas Global Headlines.
Ukraine claims a Russian missile strike in Odessa residential area killed at least 21. The attack comes after Ukrainian forces pushed Russian forces from Snake Island, a strategic Black Sea island near the city of Odessa. The Kremlin has denied targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure following reports of the strike. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese welcomed a new start in relations with France as he met President Macron in Paris after an acrimonious row between the two nations over a submarine contract last year. There is no reason to change Hong Kong's one country, two systems formula of governance, said Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is on a rare visit to the global financial hub to mark the anniversary of the city's handover from the British regime to China. UK and US have slammed Beijing, claiming that China had failed to meet its handover commitments. Thousands of indigenous protesters left the Ecuadorian capital of Quito after their leaders and the government signed a deal that would cut fuel prices, ending weeks of deadly protests and strikes against the rising cost of living. At least 9 protesters have been killed in Sudan, bringing the total tally of protesters killed since the coup takeover to 111. Large crowds are protesting against the military leadership that seized power 8 months ago, as the economic crisis in the country has deepened. Google has agreed to pay $90 million to settle a legal fight with the app developers over the money they earned creating apps for Android smartphones, and for enticing users to make in-app purchases. Rescuers found more bodies as they resumed searching for dozens of missing after a mudslide triggered by weeks of heavy downpours that killed at least 20 people at a railroad construction site in India's northeast. Soldiers joined more than 200 workers and police using bulldozers and other equipment to rescue those buried under the debris in Nani, a town near Imphal, the capital of Indian state of Manipur. Pakistan inflation has hit 21.32% in June, its highest ever in 14 years, amid higher food and fuel costs, even as the nation inches closer to an International Monetary Fund bailout. Australia have taken a 1-0 lead in the 2-match test series in Sri Lanka with a crushing 10-wicket victory in goal. Australia's spinners tore through Sri Lanka's lineup as they lost 10 wickets inside 23 overs to be bowled out for 113. The visitors got the required 5 runs to finish the test in less than 2.5 days. NBA superstar Kevin Durant has requested the Brooklyn Nets for a trade. The 2-time Finals MVP has 4 years remaining on his Nets contract, worth almost $200 million, which makes him one of the most valuable players in the league's history. The 34-year-old has reportedly shortlisted the Phoenix Suns and the Miami Heat as his preferred destinations.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas Images. Thanks very much for watching. Have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday.
Come up,